The first time retired botanist Harold Cartman noticed the amber eyes watching him through his patio door. He thought his aging vision might be playing tricks on him in the early morning light filtering through the oak trees surrounding his modest home. The silhouette was too large to be one of the neighborhood's feral cats, too wild in its posture to be a lost domestic animal. Yet there, it sat with an almost regal patience that suggested this was no accidental encounter. His two house cats, Marmalade, a rotund orange tabby with white patches, and Sooty, a sleek black cat with emerald eyes, had positioned themselves on their favorite perch by the sliding glass door, their tails twitching with an excitement he'd never seen directed toward the usual backyard visitors of squirrels and cardinals. In that suspended moment between recognition and disbelief, Harold felt the weight of discovery settle over his quiet retirement routine. The ancient thrill that had once driven his scientific career now focused on the wild predator that had somehow chosen his suburban patio as a place of daily pilgrimage. What he couldn't know then was that this single morning observation would transform his understanding of the boundaries between wild and domestic, between solitude and companionship, and between the careful distance he'd maintained from nature and the profound connections that could emerge when fear gave way to patient curiosity. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Harold Cartman had been living in the small ranch-style house on the outskirts of Gainesville, Florida, for nearly a decade since his retirement from the University of Florida's botany department. His days had settled into a comfortable routine of tending his extensive garden, cataloging the native plants that flourished in his carefully cultivated backyard ecosystem, and sharing quiet companionship with Marmalade and Sooty, the two rescue cats who had adopted him as much as he had adopted them. At 73, Harold had thought his days of scientific discovery were behind him, but the appearance of the mysterious morning visitor would prove that nature still had lessons to teach and wonders to reveal. The October morning that changed everything began like any other, with Harold preparing his coffee in the pre-dawn darkness, while Marmalade and Sooty performed their morning ritual of staring expectantly at the patio door, waiting for him to open it so they could survey their territory from the safety of the screened porch. But when Harold flicked on the outdoor light and approached the door with his steaming mug, he found himself face to face with a sight that made him stop mid-stride and nearly drop his coffee. A full-grown bobcat sat motionless on his patio, positioned approximately 10 feet from the glass door, its golden eyes fixed intently on Marmalade and Sooty. The wild cat's tawny coat was perfectly camouflaged against the autumn leaves scattered across the concrete, making Harold wonder how many mornings this visitor might have been present without his notice. What struck him most was not the bobcat's size, though it was considerably larger than his house cats, but the complete stillness of the encounter, as if all three cats had agreed to some unspoken protocol for this unprecedented meeting. Marmalade, typically the more social of his two cats, had pressed himself against the glass with his ears forward in curiosity rather than fear. Sooty, usually skittish around strangers, sat perfectly still beside his companion, her tail twitching with what appeared to be fascination rather than anxiety. Most remarkably, the bobcat showed no signs of aggression or alarm at the presence of the domestic cats just inches away, separated only by the thin barrier of glass. "Well, I'll be damned," Harold whispered, his scientific mind immediately engaging with the implications of what he was witnessing. In 40 years of studying Florida's native flora, he'd encountered bobcats in the wild on numerous occasions, but always as fleeting glimpses of tawny fur disappearing into palmetto scrub or cypress swamps. This was different, deliberate, sustained, almost social in its intention. The tableau held for nearly 20 minutes, during which Harold found himself as motionless as the three cats, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had created this extraordinary moment. The bobcat's attention never wavered from Marmalade and Sooty, and their focus remained equally fixed on their wild visitor. It was Harold who finally moved, reaching slowly for his phone to document what he was certain no one would believe without photographic evidence. The soft sound of his movement caused the bobcat to turn its attention briefly to Harold, and in that moment of eye contact, he felt the same thrill of connection he'd experienced decades earlier when discovering a new species of orchid in the Everglades. This was a moment of pure scientific wonder, tempered by the profound awareness that he was witnessing something rare and precious that demanded respect rather than interference. As if sensing Harold's intention to maintain the peaceful nature of their encounter, the bobcat returned its attention to the house cats for several more minutes before rising with fluid grace and disappearing into the oak hammock that bordered Harold's property. Marmalade and Sooty remained at their posts for another hour, occasionally looking back at Harold as if to confirm that he too had witnessed the remarkable visitation. That evening, Harold found himself researching bobcat behavior with the same intensity he'd once applied to botanical classification. What he learned both fascinated and concerned him. Bobcats were typically solitary creatures, highly territorial and generally fearful of human habitation. For one to approach a house with such apparent calm suggested either exceptional circumstances or behavioral adaptation that warranted careful observation. The next morning, Harold positioned himself by the patio door well before dawn, coffee in hand and camera ready. At exactly 6:47 a.m., he'd begun keeping detailed notes. The bobcat materialized from the oak trees with the same silent grace as the previous day. This time, Harold was prepared to observe every detail of the encounter. The bobcat was clearly a female, based on her size and facial structure, and appeared to be in excellent health. Her coat showed no signs of injury or malnutrition, and her movements displayed the confident coordination of a successful predator. Most intriguingly, she seemed to have established a specific routine: approach the patio, settle into a comfortable position facing the door, and maintain visual contact with the house cats for approximately 20 to 30 minutes before departing. "I think we should call her Whisper," Harold announced to Marmalade and Sooty on the fourth morning of these visits, naming her for the complete silence of her arrivals and departures, since she's clearly become part of our morning routine. As the days passed, Harold documented subtle changes in the dynamic between Whisper and his house cats. Marmalade had begun what could only be described as greeting behavior, approaching the glass door with the same slow, measured movements that Whisper used in her approach to the patio. Sooty, while still more cautious, had started responding to Whisper's presence with soft chirping sounds, vocalizations Harold had never heard her make toward any other animal. Most remarkably, Whisper seemed to be learning the household routine. She began arriving earlier on weekends, as if she'd observed that Harold and the cats started their day later on Saturdays and Sundays. She also showed remarkable patience during the occasional disruptions caused by delivery trucks or neighborhood dogs, simply moving to a more concealed position and waiting for normal quiet to resume before returning to her post. 3 weeks into this daily ritual, Harold made a decision that would have seemed unthinkably reckless to his younger, more cautious self. On a particularly warm October afternoon, with Whisper in her usual position and both house cats displaying their now familiar signs of anticipation, Harold slowly slid open the patio door. The response was immediate but not alarming. Whisper's ears rotated forward and her body tensed slightly, but she made no move to flee or advance. Marmalade, emboldened by the removal of the glass barrier, took a single step onto the patio before settling into a sitting position that mirrored Whisper's posture. Sooty remained just inside the doorway, but her body language suggested curiosity rather than fear. "Easy, everyone," Harold murmured, using the same calm tone he'd once employed when approaching skittish wildlife during field research. "Let's see what happens when we trust each other." What happened was 20 minutes of the most peaceful interspecies interaction Harold had ever witnessed. Whisper maintained her distance, but showed clear interest in the house cat's responses to this new level of access. Marmalade, displaying a confidence that surprised his owner, gradually moved to within 6 feet of the wild bobcat, before settling down in a patch of sunlight streaming across the patio. The sight of his rotund orange tabby cat sunbathing in apparent harmony with a wild predator struck Harold as both absurd and profoundly beautiful. This was not supposed to happen according to everything he knew about animal behavior, yet here it was unfolding with a naturalness that suggested some deeper understanding between the three cats that transcended species boundaries. From that afternoon forward, Harold left the patio door open during Whisper's visits, creating what he came to think of as a neutral zone where wild and domestic could coexist without the barriers that human fear typically imposed. The arrangement seemed to work perfectly for all parties involved, with Whisper never venturing inside the house and Marmalade and Sooty respecting the invisible boundary that kept them from approaching too closely to their wild visitor. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. As autumn deepened into winter, Harold found himself increasingly concerned about Whisper's welfare. Florida winters were generally mild, but the occasional cold snaps could be challenging for wildlife, and Harold's attachment to his morning visitor had grown beyond scientific interest into genuine care for her well-being. He began leaving fresh water in a ceramic bowl near the edge of the patio, far enough from the house to respect Whisper's wild nature, but close enough to provide support during dry periods. The water disappeared regularly, though Harold could never be certain whether Whisper or other wildlife was responsible. More importantly, he noticed that Whisper's visits were becoming longer, sometimes extending into the afternoon hours when the winter sun warmed the concrete patio. The relationship between Whisper and the house cats continued to evolve in ways that challenged Harold's understanding of feline social dynamics. Marmalade had developed what appeared to be a friendship ritual with Whisper, beginning each encounter with a slow approach to within a few feet of the wild cat, followed by a synchronized session of mutual grooming, each cat cleaning themselves while maintaining visual contact with the other. Sooty's interactions were more subtle but equally meaningful. She had begun bringing small toys to the patio door, a behavior Harold had never observed before, and would place them near the threshold as if offering gifts to their wild visitor. Whisper showed polite interest in these offerings, occasionally sniffing the toys but never actually playing with them, as if she understood the gesture without fully comprehending its domestic significance. The cold snap that arrived in early February tested the boundaries of Harold's carefully maintained non-interference policy. Temperatures dropped into the 20s for 3 consecutive nights, and Harold found himself worrying about Whisper with the intensity of concern he felt for Marmalade and Sooty. On the third night of the cold weather, Harold made a decision that surprised even him. After ensuring that Marmalade and Sooty were settled for the night, he left the patio door open by approximately 6 inches, enough to provide shelter access if Whisper needed it, but not so wide as to constitute an invitation that might alter their carefully balanced relationship. The next morning, Harold discovered that his gamble had paid off in ways he never could have anticipated. Whisper was inside the house, curled up on the living room rug in a patch of early morning sunlight, with Marmalade pressed against her left side and Sooty nestled against her right flank. The three cats were sleeping peacefully together, creating a scene of interspecies harmony that seemed to belong in a fairy tale rather than Harold's modest retirement home. Harold stood in his kitchen doorway for nearly an hour, afraid to move and disturb what might be a once-in-a-lifetime moment. The sight of his 2 house cats sleeping peacefully with a wild bobcat challenged every assumption he'd held about the boundaries between domestic and wild animals, about safety and risk, about the possibility of true interspecies friendship. When the cats finally stirred, Harold expected chaos or at least confusion. Instead, he witnessed what could only be described as a morning routine that all three cats had somehow negotiated among themselves. Whisper rose first, stretched with the fluid grace that marked all her movements, and touched noses briefly with both house cats before making her way to the patio door. Marmalade and Sooty followed, and the three cats shared what appeared to be a farewell ritual before Whisper disappeared into the oak hammock. "Well," Harold said to his house cats as they returned for their breakfast, "I guess we've officially become a three-cat household, at least part-time." From that night forward, whenever temperatures dropped below freezing, Harold left the patio door slightly ajar, and Whisper took advantage of the shelter. Her overnight visits became a source of profound joy for Harold, who found himself looking forward to the cold snaps that brought their wild visitor indoors for these brief periods of extended companionship. The arrangement worked perfectly through the remainder of the winter. Whisper never approached Harold directly during her indoor visits, maintaining her wild independence while clearly benefiting from the warmth and safety of the house. Marmalade and Sooty seemed to understand their role as hosts, sharing their space and even their food dishes. Harold often found evidence that all three cats had eaten from the same bowls during Whisper's overnight stays. Most remarkably, Whisper showed perfect house manners during her visits. She never damaged furniture, never marked territory, and never attempted to hunt the house cats, despite being perfectly capable of overpowering them. Her behavior suggested an intelligence and adaptability that went far beyond Harold's previous understanding of Bobcat capabilities. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. When spring arrived in March, Harold noticed changes in Whisper's behavior that filled him with both pride and melancholy. Her visits became less frequent, occurring only every few days rather than daily, and she seemed restless during their encounters, as if her attention was being pulled elsewhere by natural instincts that had remained dormant during the winter months. "She's remembering that she's wild," Harold explained to Marmalade and Sooty, who seemed as confused by the change in routine as he felt. Spring means territory establishment, mate selection, all the things that wild bobcats need to do to fulfill their biological imperative. By early April, Whisper's visits had stopped entirely, leaving Harold and his house cats to resume their previous morning routine of coffee and patio observation without their remarkable wild companion. The house felt somehow smaller without the possibility of Whisper's presence, and Harold found himself checking the oak hammock hopefully each morning, despite knowing that she had almost certainly moved on to establish her own territory elsewhere. Marmalade and Sooty seemed to share Harold's sense of loss. Both cats spent more time than usual staring out the patio door, and Sooty continued her ritual of bringing toys to the threshold, despite the absence of their intended recipient. Harold documented these behavioral changes with the same scientific rigor he'd applied to observing Whisper's integration into their household routine, recognizing that grief and loss were universal experiences that transcended species boundaries. 3 weeks passed without any sign of Whisper, and Harold began to accept that their extraordinary winter of interspecies companionship had come to its natural end. He felt grateful for the experience while mourning its conclusion, understanding that wild animals belonged in the wild, despite the profound connections that could sometimes develop across species lines. Then, on a warm morning in late April, Harold's careful acceptance of Whisper's departure was challenged by a sight that filled him with such overwhelming joy that he had to sit down to process what he was seeing. Whisper had returned, but she was not alone. 2 small bobcat cubs, probably no more than 8 weeks old, flanked their mother as she approached the familiar patio with the same measured grace that had characterized all her previous visits. The cubs were miniature versions of Whisper, their spotted coats and oversized ears giving them an almost comical appearance that contrasted sharply with their mother's dignified bearing. Harold watched in amazement as Whisper settled into her old position facing the patio door, while her cubs explored the concrete surface with the boundless curiosity of young animals discovering a new environment. When Marmalade and Sooty appeared at the door, drawn by some instinct that seemed to tell them something extraordinary was happening, the cubs' response was immediate and enthusiastic. Rather than showing fear or aggression, the young bobcats approached the glass door with tails high and ears forward, displaying the same calm curiosity that had characterized their mother's first encounters with the house cats. Most remarkably, Marmalade and Sooty responded to the cubs with what could only be described as parental behavior, making soft chirping sounds and pressing themselves against the glass as if trying to offer comfort and reassurance to the young animals. "She brought them to meet you," Harold whispered in amazement, understanding that Whisper had made a deliberate choice to introduce her offspring to the unusual interspecies family that had provided her with shelter and companionship during the winter months. When Harold slowly opened the patio door, the scene that unfolded exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. Whisper remained in her supervisory position, while her cubs cautiously approached Marmalade and Sooty, who had positioned themselves just outside the doorway in poses that suggested welcome rather than territorial defense. The first direct contact occurred when the smaller of the two cubs, apparently emboldened by curiosity, approached within touching distance of Marmalade. The orange tabby, displaying patience and gentleness that Harold had never seen him show toward any other animal, remained perfectly still as the young bobcat sniffed his fur and even attempted to initiate play behavior. Sooty's interaction with the larger cub was equally touching, as she began the soft chirping vocalizations that she'd developed during Whisper's winter visits, apparently recognizing these sounds as a form of communication that transcended species barriers. The cub responded by settling down near Sooty in a posture that mirrored her own, creating a moment of peaceful coexistence that seemed to validate everything Harold had learned about the possibility of friendship across species lines. For the next hour, Harold witnessed what could only be described as a family reunion, as Whisper supervised her cub's introduction to the domestic cats who had become such an important part of her own life. The young bobcats showed none of the wariness that might be expected from wild animals, instead displaying the confidence that came from their mother's obvious comfort with this unusual situation. Most remarkably, when one of the cubs became tired and began seeking a comfortable place to rest, Marmalade positioned himself near the young animal and began the soft purring that served as a universal feline comfort signal. The cub, apparently recognizing this gesture of kindness, settled down beside the much larger house cat and began purring in response, creating a harmony of contentment that filled Harold with overwhelming emotion. "This is what the world could be like," Harold said softly, documenting the scene with photographs that he knew would serve as proof of this extraordinary moment for years to come. "If we could all just accept that differences don't have to mean barriers." As afternoon approached, Whisper began showing signs that the visit was drawing to a close. She rose from her supervisory position and made soft vocalizations to her cubs, who responded immediately by moving to her side. But before departing, she did something that Harold would remember for the rest of his life. Whisper approached the patio door where Harold stood watching, closer than she had ever come to him during all their months of acquaintance. For a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, the wild bobcat and the retired botanist regarded each other with mutual respect and understanding, two beings who had found common ground in their care for the remarkable family they had somehow created together. Then, with a final touch of noses between her cubs and the house cats, a gesture that looked remarkably like a farewell kiss, Whisper led her young family back into the oak hammock, leaving Harold with the profound certainty that he had witnessed something that would change his understanding of connection, family, and the extraordinary possibilities that emerged when fear gave way to trust. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. In the months that followed, Whisper and her cubs became irregular but treasured visitors to Harold's patio, creating an extended family dynamic that defied conventional understanding of wild and domestic animal relationships. The cubs grew rapidly under their mother's expert care, but they never lost their acceptance of Marmalade and Sooty as honorary family members, often initiating play sessions that left Harold marveling at the adaptability and emotional intelligence of all the animals involved. Harold's documentation of these extraordinary relationships eventually caught the attention of wildlife researchers at the University of Florida, who were fascinated by his detailed observations of sustained positive interactions between wild and domestic cats. His photographs and behavioral notes contributed to a growing body of research, suggesting that the boundaries between wild and domestic animals were more fluid than previously understood, and that individual relationships could transcend species barriers in ways that benefited all parties involved. But for Harold, Marmalade, and Sooty, the scientific implications were secondary to the simple joy of their expanded family. The old wooden house had become a haven where wild and domestic coexisted in harmony, where trust had replaced fear, and where the morning coffee routine now included the possibility of extraordinary visitors who had taught them all that family could be defined by love and acceptance, rather than species or genetics. The oak trees surrounding Harold's property continued to shelter countless wild creatures, but they also served as a bridge between two worlds: the wild realm where Whisper and her cubs lived according to their natural instincts, and the domestic sanctuary where Marmalade and Sooty provided warmth, friendship, and proof that the heart's capacity for love knew no boundaries. Years later, when Harold looked back on his retirement, he would remember the morning Whisper first appeared at his patio door as the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of his life, a time when scientific observation had given way to profound connection, when his quiet house had become a symbol of the extraordinary families that could emerge when different beings chose trust over fear, and when three cats had taught an old botanist that the most important discoveries often happened not in laboratories or field studies, but in the simple act of opening a door and welcoming the unexpected into one's life. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.